Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I know I haven't been here for a while, but I'll be back soon. So I thought I'd come here and talk to you about a part two version of books you need for your first year of med school after I finished first year of med school. So the first video was in med school. Now I'm done first year. So let's get through some of the, books I actually used. So there were, I think, a lot of extra books in my previous video that I don't think I actually used for medicine. So I'm here to talk about the books that I ended up using. So for anatomy, it's a very memory-based subject, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it's still conceptual. So for this, I primarily used KLM as my main textbook and Netter's Anatomy. And at the end, towards exam season, I also use BRS Anatomy and this little coloring book right here. So this is your Netter's Atlas. This is KLM. This is the BRS series. I didn't really read through it. I think I used it for the questions mainly because the questions are amazing. And I use this coloring book to understand topics that were a little difficult. So I wanted to try to make them more engaging and try to make anatomy a little more fun. Um, and the last thing that I did was I actually went to the anatomy lab and I looked at real models and I studied them with my friend and we asked each other questions, we tested each other, we talked about confusions, and especially it's really good for Viva, like it's like sort of like Viva practice you're doing when you ask someone a question and they have to verbally say it. So really great for that OSCE Viva sort of component. Apart from that, you can also use Gray's Anatomy or BD Charusia. These are the three main textbooks that kind of go, and people go for those. In terms of like BD Charusia's handbook, I didn't really think it was necessary, guys. I think you can find like the first chapter of KLM covers most of what is mentioned in BD Charusia's handbook, so I don't necessarily think it's a necessity to read through that book for foundation module, which is like usually the first module in med school where they teach you like basics. But it's up to you. I personally did not find it very helpful, so I wouldn't advise it, but it's definitely a personal choice you make. For histology, which is another branch of anatomy, so anatomy has three branches. There's gross anatomy, which we talked about here. Then there's histology, and lastly, embryology. So histology is the study of tissues. It's probably one of the easiest and most boring subjects in med school. But that being said, it is still important to know because if you know how a normal tissue looks, you're going to know how an abnormal tissue looks. So it is important you know histology so that you can really look at pathology because morphology, which is the way a tissue looks, is important when you're studying pathology. If you have pathology in first year of med school, which I know not all med schools have. So I used Lycosane. This is the only book you need. If you want to look at pictures, I used Weeders. You can also use Janquera. It's just for the pictures, guys. We don't read through these. Embryology. So for embryology, I think this is one of those subjects that you really need to visualize for, and that there is no other way to put it, honestly. There are a couple books. I used KLM, and you also have the option of using Langman's. I like Langman's a lot because it's super like the diagrams are very simple. They're not, as detailed as it would be in like KLM, which I feel like is very, very detailed. I think this book is much more shorter, it's simpler, it's less daunting. But definitely with this book, there's clinical. So this is like the anatomy book for KLM. It has blue pages for clinicals, and those are really great. So for clinicals, I would definitely recommend reading through this. But let's say you don't want to read through the main content from this book, you might want to consider Langman's. Uh, with any subject in med school, it's better to choose one textbook. Uh, but this was the one subject that I kind of like would use both, but like mainly this because my test questions at my university mainly come from this textbook. So depending on the university and the level of detail they go to, this book is definitely more detailed. Uh, you can choose which one works best. You don't want to be choosing too many textbooks for yourself. Just choose one and just stick with it. Don't try to change it as much. However, you can definitely look at other books to reference them, to see what they have in there for certain topics that might be confusing. Lastly, for a review book, I used High Yield Embryology. So for all these top subjects as I'm talking about them, you're going to need one like textbook and then one review book. That's typically how it works. I love high yield because this is like the most thin book you'll use in med school. It literally, it's like barely anything. And it is very, very high yield. Don't look at the size. Trust me, it has a lot of information. And the best part about it is it has case studies at the end, which you can read through, and it gives you a really good clinical perspective. The way we use review books essentially is mainly for exam season, honestly. But what you can do is as you're learning topics, make sure to try to find that topic in your high yield embryology book or whatever review book you're using, and then try to annotate on there. If there's extra things that your college wants to emphasize on, put those in there before exam season even kicks in. So when exam season kicks in, you're not looking at these textbooks. You're just looking at this one book and it's not as daunting as looking and reading through a textbook. So the next subjects we're going to talk about is physiology. So for this one, we need the textbook, none other than Guyton and Hall, textbook of medical physiology. It's probably one of the best textbooks you could use for physiology. It's 1,000 pages long. It is um, it's quite a read actually. So it does take a lot of time, but what you want to emphasize with this is initially what I would do in medicine is like when I first started, I didn't know how to study, so I would read through the textbook and I would take notes along with it. And that's a horrendous idea. So don't take notes as you're reading through this book. What I like to do, which is a really great way, and this reflects active recall, I usually read the PDF version and I'll highlight things on there that I could turn into question. For example, if it asks me, what is an action potential, I will highlight maybe like a line or two in the book that gives that answer, and then I will put it either onto Enki or some other like an Excel sheet and just put it as a question there to test myself on. And that way I don't have to write the answer. The answers are all in here. I just copy paste them. So it makes the process 10 times easier because you don't really have to write the answers down. It's kind of already in there. And you're also testing yourself by uh, putting some questions down for yourself and then really reviewing those questions. You don't just make the questions and leave them there. You review them later on, and you review them on intervals because we believe in active recall and spaced repetition here. So if you don't know what those terms mean, better check out more videos on my YouTube channel for that. So for this other textbook that I have here, this is Costanzo. It's pretty great. I used it for CVS because honestly there was too many chapters and I couldn't read them. Quite honestly speaking, this book is really, really long and sometimes it makes me want to cry that I'm reading through it. But Costanzo was a great resource for CVS because CVS means cardiovascular, and because it was super like short and nice, it was very straightforward. So this book is a little more like it tells you a long story, takes you on a walk in the forest, and then this one kind of like straight to the point. And if you guys don't know, this book, the BRS series is actually based on what's mentioned in this book. So this book, these two books go hand in hand. This is the textbook, this is the review book. Definitely recommend buying this book even if you're reading through Gaian, it doesn't matter. But the BRS series physiology book is probably one of the best BRS books you'll find. I wouldn't even recommend thinking about another physio review book. I would just go with BRS. Amazing questions, great review resource. So in med school, I've known people who use BRS for literally all the subjects, and they'll do the questions in there particularly. But for this one, it's also really helpful for the notes they have in there. It gives you really in-depth summary. Uh, Trust me, this book is amazing. So, for pathology, for those that do have pathology in med school, I know at Dow we have pathology, we have micro, we have pharma, we have all those subjects. And for this subject, I think it's very straightforward what books you'll use. So I use mainly Pathoma. It's really the top of the top. We're talking about the king of pathology. So this book is very well put through. It is written for USMLE prep, but that doesn't mean you can't use it. Most of the USMLE prep books are pretty great, I would say. So for your textbook, this is more of like a review book for the textbook. I don't like to read through basis, honestly, but rapid review pathology, this is Golgi pathology, it's great. It's also made for the steps, but I think this textbook, the difference between basis and this textbook is that basis is very wordy. It's like convoluted. It's like it's based on a lot of literature, and this book is in bullet points. So everything in this book is actually in bullet points. So they just summarize things for you. It's still a pretty heavy textbook. Like, don't be fooled by the fact that it's a review book. It's still a really big textbook. What I would recommend using for basis, like what would you use basis for, is really looking at the pictures in basis, because chances are those pictures will show up maybe in your OSPs, where they'll ask you, okay, like what is this? And you're gonna be like, okay, I've seen this image. I know this is KCS necrosis. So you want to make sure you look at the images, especially the ones that come on lecture slides. Um, those might be high yield for your exam, so do try to pay attention to them. There's also orange and blue boxes and bases. If you're really up for it, you can also read through them. If you have that time, you can also read through them. The blue boxes summarize the section, and then the orange boxes, they give you morphology, and like so they tell you like, okay. And when I was talking about histology, I was talking about how morphologies are very, very important. So what this does is they'll give you like an idea of how the pathological I'm not getting the word here. How it looks like, like how this tissue looks like in that pathological condition, and they'll describe to you its different signs. Like for example, it has an eosinophilic inclusion, or it looks really red or whatever. They'll give you like that detailed account of how the actual tissue looks like in this pathological condition. So that's another one that I would highlight. Biochemistry, one of the most hated subjects in medical school, but by far I think it's also a very interesting subject. It's the only subject that you'll actually have to really think about processes, and by processes I mean flowcharts. So biochemistry is one of those subjects with tons of flowcharts, tons and tons of flowcharts. You need to know how things are made. So that includes chemicals in our body. So in second year, you'll be learning about how dopamine is made. And you want to know all the substrates and the enzymes that are involved in that process. Now, there are a variety of resources that I would highlight for this subject. My first resource would be USMLE Step 1 lecture notes for biochemistry and medical genetics. And I want you to use this textbook, especially when the medical genetics section, guys, you do not want to miss that. So for the medical genetics section, watch Dr. Sam Turco's lectures along with this. It'll be a great resource. And for pathology, I forgot to mention, you want to be watching the lectures that Dr. Hussein Abdul Sattar has made. Uh, it makes a lot more sense. He explains to you things, so you don't want to just be reading through it. You want to be watching the lectures along with it. And for the same thing, Dr. Sam Turco's lectures. For the other sections, I don't know if you would need to watch, but I know for genetics, it was really good. So Dr. Sam Turco's lectures. This is like a review book. If you want to talk about textbooks, for biochemistry, it's a little bit confusing because you can use either Harper's, which is like this humongous textbook. I definitely don't recommend buying it, or you could use Lippincott, and I think Lippincott is a bit shorter, but still it's detailed. It's not an easy read, guys. When I first started reading Lippincott, I cried a couple of times because it wasn't a fun read. So it's not as straightforward. It is a bit wordy, and I want to warn you before you start reading this. So don't cry about it. Don't worry, it gets easier as you become accustomed to it. So for this book, I use it a lot like a reference textbook. So before I actually even jump into reading a lot of this stuff, sometimes I'll watch a short video on the topic to try to really give myself a good idea of what it's about. And that way, when I'm reading it, it's not as heavy. Sometimes I might even look at the lecture slides or the lecture itself. I have some really good biochemistry professors, so I will always listen to their lectures because they can often explain different topics. And my university uses Harper's, so they always love to include things from Harper's. And if you're using Lippincott, you're going to miss out on Harper's stuff. So it's really confusing all the time. But anyway, you can definitely use lecture slides to supplement anything missing if your university is using a different textbook. Like if you look at lecture slides, it might even have like 4 textbooks listed. That doesn't mean you have to be reading through all of them. Choose one subject to sorry for that. Choose one textbook and stick with it. So for me, I chose Lippincott. It's a reference textbook. I don't read through everything in it. Trust me, you don't need to read through everything in it. A lot of the things can be easily explained by a YouTuber, so why not? And by Dr. Samko. Um, However, the nitty-gritty details that are testable, they will come in your lecture slides, so make sure to put attention to them. Lastly, there's this review book. It's a local book. It's called Instant Biochemistry by Faik Ahmed. And just one warning about this book, it contains some false information. So there are a few little errors in there, especially I noticed some in the amino acid section. So once you start reading this, make sure to really like reference from, this textbook, like especially if you're reading about the amino acids, acidic amino acids, there's different classes. So you want to make sure that it's not off. It's just a couple of small errors. It still doesn't matter because at the end of the day, this book is still a great review resource. And it takes a lot of notes from Harper's, so that's great too. It's especially useful for your first few weeks at med school because this book is like a great summary. It's so small, especially for your carbohydrates, like all your macromolecules, you want to do it from this. Medical genetics, definitely from this. So, really try and wait it out. This is a review book for memory information. So if you want to remember all the different amino acid classes, this is a book for you. If you want to know how transcription happens, these two are the books you want to be using. So that's a little touch into biochemistry. Lastly, we're going to talk about microbiology. So for microbiology, I did use Levinson's, and honestly, I found it too long. I found it too wordy. I found it really lengthy. It just wasn't as helpful, but I did read through it. I did a whole unit from it for my blood module. Um, and yeah, and that's on that. And the book that I use now is Microbiology. Clinical Microbiology Made Ridiculously Simple. It's an amazing book. It contains like cartoons and explains to you microbiology in a very simple manner, rather than overcomplicating it. So, when it comes to med school, it's all about efficiency, choosing the right books for you. And the books that are working for me may not work for you, and that's okay. Always explore your options, but don't buy too many books. And I waited. I didn't buy my books right away. I actually waited until I discovered and looked at some PDFs. I looked at the books that other people had in hand, and I waited before I jumped into buying the books. And I want you to do the same because you need to experiment with what works for you, right? So there are PDF versions of these books available online, so you can check them out before purchasing them. And buying way too many books is not a good idea for med school. You already have a lot of content to get through. Lastly, there is a local review book. It's by Shurji Ahmed. It's a 24-hour review of microbiology. It's an amazing book. You can't find it online, and I'm sure you'll find it in the local market. And I think I would also recommend that book. And yeah, that's I think it. We come to the end. Oh, we've got pharmacology. Can't forget this one. Okay, so this is like one of my favorite subjects in med school. I know it's one of the subjects that also many people hate. And the thing about pharmacology is it's like imagine you're an engineer and you have to learn Python, coding, JavaScript, all that. Pharmacology is basically the extra language you learn in medicine. It is a language of its own, and you want to treat it like that. So when you come to pharmacology, don't come with a closed mind. Come with an open mind, ready to accept the fact that this is a new language you're learning. And that will definitely help you because I do have some pharmacological background, so I kind of know a bit of it, which did give me an advantage. I know some of the drug names, and that was helpful. Uh, but as far as textbook goes, there's Katzung and then there's Lippincott. So I use Lippincott because once again, Katzung is just so detailed, and I was like, I don't have time for this. So I use Lippincott. Any will do, honestly, it doesn't matter. I just found this a bit shorter and easier to use. And you can also use the USMLE Sub 1 lecture notes for pharmacology. They're not the greatest, but I think they definitely really point out the high yield information, the highly testable information. I also recommend using first aid for like high yield points, especially if you're considering doing USMLEs and all of that. I think even if you're not, I think this book has great high yield points for all the subjects. So I think you should buy it in first year. So as you're going through different topics, maybe you'll find that topic in first aid, and you can just cover through that and see what are the high yield points, what are the things that are most important. And maybe I'll make a video in the future about how to use first aid as a resource, because you don't just want to be reading through it, you want to be utilizing this book. This book is a lot like an outline of all the medical topics, an outline of the high yield information, but you have to know what is the importance of that information, how can I utilize it, and how can it be relevant to me. So you don't just want to be reading through this. Lastly, um, I will talk about Anking. And Anking, if you guys don't know what Anki is, Anki is a software that helps you make flashcards. I have a YouTube video on how you can download it and get your account set and get your whole system set up for it. So you just make flashcards and it tests you on repeated intervals. So active recall and spaced repetition. So what it does is when you make a card, you will be tested that card uh, twice the first time you make it, and then it might test you like a day later, and then 3 days later, and then maybe a week later, and then a month later, and you keep testing yourself on this card you've made. It's a flashcard, and this will help really nitty gritty things stick in your head. And this is what Anki is helpful. Now, Anking Anking is a bit different. Anking is like the medical step one, step two, big deck that will save your life. So even if you're not studying for the steps, this deck is definitely helpful. It has everything organized into different organ systems. So if you've done your cardiovascular module, as you're doing that cardiovascular module, maybe activate your uh, CVS cards for that. So, you can activate certain cards in this, and then you can test yourself on those cards only. And then you can even do pharmacology on this. Pharmacology is like one of the only subjects that I would be like, okay, you need to use Anki because it's very, very, very memory based. You have to remember a lot of things. So you want to remember drug names, their classes, their mechanism of action, their drug interactions. Oh, you're gonna need to put it into Anki. And this deck already has pharmacology decks in there, so you have the cards ready for you. You don't even have to. You just use this as your resource. Other books to have, like I mentioned before, First Aid. Uh, please try and use this book. I will make a detailed video on how to use it. I feel like I'm still learning, so as soon as I have a hold of this, I'm definitely going to come on here and guide you through this process. So yeah, that's it. Um, Thank you for joining in and tuning in on this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Do check out my other videos, subscribe to my YouTube channel, like and share, comment, let me know what other videos you guys want to see. Let me know how you guys like this video. Was it helpful? How do you guys want me to go about for future videos? So yeah, thank you guys and have an awesome day. That's Fantastic Days out. I